In this lecture, we're going to use the state pattern to help us build the logic for our menu system. It may not seem like it, but the state pattern can be helpful for building a menu system. If you think about it, most menu screens are the same. Menus are just lists of options. The difference between different menus is the options themselves. Rather than creating a document for each menu, we can consolidate the menus into a single document. However, we must be able to decide which menu to display. Only one menu can be displayed at a time. In this case, we can refer to each menu as a state. Therefore, the state pattern can be useful for switching between menus. Doesn't make sense? Don't worry, as we work on the menu, it'll become clearer. First, we must create a base state. Unlike the previous base state, we're going to take a slightly different approach. Let's get started. In the Scripts folder, create a new folder called UI. Code related to the UI will be placed in a separate folder. Not necessary, but recommended to keep a project organized. In this new directory, create a new file called UI base state. Next, create another file called UI controller. Our controller will be the component attached to the UI document object. This component will be responsible for loading and switching to new states. Before writing code, let's add this component. Select the UI document game object. On this object, add the UI controller component. Great, let's start setting up the base state. In Visual Studio Code, open the base state file. Let's start by replacing the contents of this file with a namespace called rpg.ui. Since the class won't be a component, it isn't necessary to use the default code. I'm introducing a new namespace called UI. Code related to the UI will be placed in this namespace. Next, create a class called UI base state. The class should have the abstract keyword after the public keyword. Keep in mind, the base state acts as the template for other states. It's not meant to be instantiated. This helps us guarantee that all new states have the same structure. In this class, define an abstract method called enterState. Define another abstract method called selectButton. Menu systems all have the option to make a selection. All of our menus will define this method. I think it would be a good idea to define this method from the base to remind us to define the method. But what about an updateState method? Typically, menus don't need to perform updates on every frame. Most menus are event-based. Unless you have an animation, adding the updateState method is optional. There's one difference between the base state for the UI and the base state for the enemy. Let's open the enemy's base state. For the enemy's base state, the enterState and updateState methods accept an instance of the component. This gives the state access to other components and Unity's methods. This solution is great for states with one or two methods. However, our UI system is going to be more complex than the enemy's state. Not all states will have the same methods. We may need additional methods in specific states. Rather than passing in an instance of the component, let's cache the instance in a variable. Back in the UI state, let's create a variable. At the top of the class, define a public variable called controller with the UI controller class as the type. Next, let's update this variable. Abstract classes are allowed to have an implementation for their constructor methods. Let's use the constructor method to set the variable. Define a public method called UI base state. The name of the method must match the name of the class. Otherwise, it'll be treated as a regular method. Constructor methods can have parameters. Let's accept an instance of the UI controller class as a parameter called UI. Next, Set the controller variable to the UI parameter. Whenever a new state is created, we must always call this constructor method. Otherwise, none of our states will have access to the instance. This is an alternative solution to exposing the component instance to our class. Previously, we accepted this information on each method. This time, we're storing the instance in a variable that will be exposed to the entire class. The main advantage of this solution is not passing in the instance to each method. If we had 20 methods, not all methods would need the same parameters. I consider this solution superior because it allows a base class to have more than a few methods. Our base state is ready. In the next lecture, let's start creating the main menu state.